Life is full of irony. As a child, you think you are special, and then you spend the rest of your life realizing how ordinary you really are. Of course, there are people who never get this message. These are the ones who live their whole lives like smug idiots. In a way, I envy this ignorance. The war between our high opinion of ourselves and the reality of everyday existence can be troubling for some people. But this only made me a pragmatist. You know the parable of the pessimist and the glass half empty. Well, for the pragmatist, the problem is that the glass is the wrong size, so we spend our lives sizing things right. For example, I was an average guy. That's why I didn't even think about playing basketball. And since I was a nerd, I didn't consider asking the prom queen to my senior prom. I simply did what reality dictated. I was basically a face in the crowd. I had my own hobbies, and I did them whenever I could, but my family was middle class, but poor. Therefore, my entertainment was limited to ordinary and cheap things. I accepted it. The only thing that set me apart was my academic ability. I might not be Einstein, but I could play him on TV. My problem was that I studied everything. So when I left school, I was in the first class of Jack of all trades, master of none. When I entered the job market, my almost but not quite sufficient qualifications became a big problem. I was on everyone's list of candidates, but I was never chosen. So I found a niche for myself. I found one career where you need to know a lot, but you don't really need to know anything specific. I became an academician. It took another 4 years to get the union card, a doctorate. But once I got it, I found that I was very much in demand. After several recruiting visits, I found myself working at a state university near Bethpage, New York. Bethpage would be a classic Long Island town if it weren't for the fact that Leroy Grumman founded a small company there to build cats for the Navy. The last of this famous series, Tomcat, was discontinued in 1991, but the spirit of heaven still hovers in secluded corners. So it wasn't like moving to Sleepy Hollow. I chose Bethpage mainly because it was close to work and equally close to the water on both sides of the island. I'm from Wisconsin, and I love sailing, so I kept a 31C and C Corvette cruiser permanently berthed at the Oyster Bay Marina. I was by no means rich, but I was lonely, and surprisingly, he began to earn good money, so the banks were willing to provide financing, even if it was a 35-year-old boat. Everyone should have at least one weakness, and the peace and quiet of Long Island Sound was my addiction. I learned to swim on Lake Michigan, so I'm an excellent solo sailor, and the boat gave me the freedom to get away for weekends from April to October. I would leave immediately after class, drive to Mount Sinai Bay, then stop for the night and continue around Orient Point and down past Gardner Island on the Tuck to Montauk, or sailed against the northeast wind to Block Island, and if he started early, he got to Wynyard. If the wind was favorable, my dog Buster, and I would arrive on Saturday afternoon. I would then party until early Sunday morning and head back on a wide tack. Did I mention Buster? I found him at a shelter in Detroit. I was living in Ann Arbor at the time and wanted a dog. The other dogs barked at the front of the cage. Only Buster sat in the back corner, radiating misery. He was the biggest, ugliest, and scariest animal in the shelter, and he knew for sure that no one would want him. I couldn't resist. My heart sank with pity for this big guy. Adopting Buster taught me one lesson about God's creatures. It's the soul that matters, not the appearance. There is no sweeter and kinder creature in the world than my dog. He just looks like he got shaved by a grizzly bear. At first, he didn't accept the boat. He was a street dog from Detroit, after all. But he went anyway because he is my friend, and friends do this for each other. Now he's a little more naval than Admiral Halsey. He sits on the bow, with his ears flapping in the wind like flags on a clipper ship, and he makes a memorable figure. However, with the exception of my occasional visits to seaside bars, my social life was what you would expect in a place like Bethpage None. I could go to town, or further up the island to trendier places like the Hamptons, but I was too shy to stand out in a New York dance club. and I was nowhere near rich or polished enough to fit into the Southampton social scene. Apparently, I had a whole campus full of maturing co-eds, and I was only 8 to 10 years older than most of them. But there is an invisible line between teacher and student that I was not about to cross. It's a matter of respect. It's hard to teach people if you also have sex with some of them, and at best, the teaching staff was a dubious prospect. Most academic women were married, and those who weren't, as a rule, were either ugly, gay, or not interested in shaving. Sometimes they were both. Plus, if your relationship with your co-worker goes south, thanks to an open-ended contract, you'll have to deal with her for the next 50 years. That's why I preferred safety. So I survived on random city folk and whoever I could find in the local social clubs. I wasn't into bridge or discussing books, but that's what I was doomed to do. Of course, the single women who attended such events were a bit ephemeral, to say the least. And being a red-blooded American male, I quickly learned what it meant to respect my boundaries. And then one late August day, everything changed. A year ago, I received a permanent contract and was promoted to the next step. It was a nice jump in status and salary, and I was only 32 years old. I was at one of those terrible faculty meetings, sipping cheap sherry. We welcomed new employees to what could be called a common room in a modern academic building. The predominant theme was linoleum rather than thick carpets and mahogany. I looked out the window, dying of boredom, and then I heard a warm Australian accent. "It's certainly miserable here, isn't it?" I turned my head and looked at her. She was relatively short, with dark brown hair and what could be considered a strong build. She had a pretty, but not beautiful face with large brown eyes and an upturned nose. But her lips caught my attention. She had a wide, sensual mouth with perfectly contoured lips. Movie stars pay a fortune for lips like these. Otherwise, she looked presentable, but not spectacular ordinary breasts, hips, and legs. In fact, she was the female equivalent of me. No one would turn around if she entered the room, but no one would run away screaming either. We were just two average people. However, I liked the sparkle in her very intelligent eyes. I turned to her in a classic conversation position and said, "Yes, it is. A lot of this place was built in the 1960s, and that was not the era of classical academic architecture." The more I looked at her sweet oval face, the more I liked what I saw. I asked, "Are you a new teacher?" She smiled. It was a 10-megawatt smile. At this moment, my thoughts were not of a sexual nature, but they were moving in this direction. I knew that the person inside that average body was someone I wanted to meet. She said, "Yes, don't you remember me from the interview?" I sat with a couple of colleagues to interview candidates for an open teaching position, but I didn't remember her. She said, "It was over Skype. I was at the University of Queensland at the time." Now I remembered her. I sat to the side of the monitor. That's why I heard it rather than saw it. But I haven't seen her close enough to know her in real life. And after all, it was 11 p.m. at the time due to the time difference with Australia. However, I had to remember her sexy, smoky contralto voice. It said a lot about her personality. She just sounded so confident and composed. I also knew her biography, and one thing I was sure of was that she was brilliant. Her publications were better than mine, although she was younger, and she has already established herself at a global university. So I asked the stereotypical question, "What is a smart girl like you doing in a place like this?" I mean, Farmingdale isn't exactly Cambridge, Massachusetts. She smiled a little shyly and said, "I wanted to try something new, preferably on the other side of the world." I didn't insist. I said, "Well then, let me show you one of the many fine establishments in the area. It will completely make you forget the nightlife in a backwater place like Brisbane." This was said with an ironic wink, as Brisbane is like Miami Beach in Australia. She grabbed my hand, spilling my sherry in the process, and said, "Let's go, mate." She sounded like Crocodile Dundee. Do they really say that? She's Australian, so naturally she drank beer. It was Friday, and Mr. Barry's was busy. We found a semi-quiet place in the back. Nobody noticed us. But of course, there was nothing remarkable about us other than the fact that we were both clearly very interested in each other. I placed 22 ounces of Brickhouse 21 Club in front of her. She took a long sip, wiped her mouth on her sleeve, and said, "Damn, this is good." Then she burped politely. What a woman! I was in love. The more we talked, the more I was drawn to her captivating eyes. He was a very smart man, but she had a woman's mind, not a man's. My nerd friends love to have a charade where we joke over beer. I hesitate to use the word infantile, but if the shoe fits, wear it. On the other hand, Zoe made insightful and funny observations about the local fauna. I realized that she was trying to understand the local culture, but her humorous take on her new world was a breath of fresh air. I also felt a subconscious feeling that she was evaluating me. It was as if she was walking around and inspecting me like a horse she was about to buy. I didn't have to think about it. She was a completely put-together woman with a sweet face and a cute little body whose company I increasingly wanted to be in. She definitely wasn't a sex bomb, and talking to her did not evoke thoughts of sweaty nights of passion. Instead, it evoked the comfortable and intimate feelings of camaraderie, the joy of friendly banter, and the intimacy you would want in a life partner. In short, she was the kind of person you want to be with for a long time. From the very beginning of our relationship, we finish each other's sentences. We were so in sync. I wish I could tell you that we came back to my place and had sex. But fantasy rarely happens for most guys, and this definitely shouldn't have happened between me and Zoe. However, that evening marked the beginning of a relationship that worked from the start. We just wanted to be together. It was like fate. I asked Zoe on our first official date 2 days after we met. I wanted to show her the boat since my house was not a girl's den. I lived in one of those old blue-collar houses that were built around the Grumman plant. It was 1,800 square feet of World War II nostalgia, but Buster and I called it home. I bought it as repossessed property. There were many of these as work moved to other parts of the country. She stayed at Extended Stay America on Oyster Bay Road while she looked for a place, so it was an easy half-hour ride to the boat. I drove up to her hotel. She was already waiting for me in the hall. There was pure joy on her face, on mine too, but for a different reason. It was hot and sunny for late August, so she wore skimpy white shorts and a cute pink t-shirt that said, "Hello Kitty," and featured a pit bull with a bow next to her left ear like the Hello Kitty logo. It reflected her perfectly. She was definitely sassy. This was the first time I had seen her outside of a professional setting, and I was amazed by her muscular legs, her perfect toned thighs, and her ass. I didn't want to admit it, but she was every stereotype about Australian women. She's only 5'4", but under that t-shirt she looked strong and fit. She was not so much sexy as athletic. She was not Venus. She was a slender goddess of the hunt, like Diana. I probably held my gaze too long, appraising her, because she said with a certain amount of sarcasm, "Like what you see?" I gave her a theatrical grin and said, "Of course I like it." For this, I was lightly hit on the arm. But to be honest, I really enjoyed the view. Zoe definitely wasn't that sexy. I am a boy. I can't help but speculate about any woman and her abilities in bed. But the thought never crossed my mind with Zoe. She just didn't see herself that way. She saw herself as the best companion in the world. She was a woman with perfect empathy for the man she was with, and she was a genius at aligning herself with their interests. She chatted animatedly for the entire half hour. When we got to the boat, she was looking at the almost 40-foot mast in admiration. She's from Brisbane, so you'd think she'd be used to sailboats. But like I said, Zoe is a nerd, so she was much more at home in the library than at sea. However, she is clever, so she jumped on board like she was born there. I wanted to get to know her better. Don't spend all day on sail. But I took her out to Oyster Bay anyway, just to show the boat off before heading to my destination. I raised the sails and we walked around for a bit, just so she could experience it. My reasons were simple. I knew how ordinary I was, so I did what I hoped would make me special in her eyes. I also wanted to understand how comfortable she feels in real life. I knew she had a broad outlook, but relationships cannot be built only on ideas, so I wanted to test her a little to see how well she handles physical things. What I discovered was that her well-built little body was much more agile than mine, and she almost immediately began handling the ropes like a pro. She may have been small, but she was very strong and smart. As I expected, she was delighted with the experience. We walked past Lloyd's Point and stopped at the shores of the Park Comset. I got a small kayak and took us to shore. The park was nice and peaceful, and I planned to follow the walking trail until I found a good spot overlooking the bay. When we found such a place, I took off my backpack, laid out the blanket, and took out lunch. I also had good wine and 2 cheap glasses. She sat on the blanket and watched me prepare the feast. We clinked glasses, and I said, "Welcome to New York." She smiled with real affection and said, "Well, if the first week is any indication, I'll love it here. I'm tired of beating around the bush." There was one important question hanging in the air, begging to be asked. I said, "Why did you leave Brisbane? This is one of the most ideal places on earth, and the University of Queensland is much better than the one you're at now." She knew it was coming, and she didn't like it. I saw it in her eyes. She was lying on her side, facing me, leaning on one hand and holding a glass in the other. She set it down carefully. Then she pulled her legs up and wrapped her arms around her knees, turning towards the water. It was a classic defensive pose. She started. It was like a story. "Charlie and I grew up together in Wavell Heights. This is a suburb of Brisbane. We went to school together from childhood until college. Everyone thought we would get married." She made a face and said, "But Charlie was into rugby, not his studies. So while I went to university and got my PhD, he joined the Royal Australian Navy." A shadow appeared on her face. She said, "We were separated a lot, but I didn't care. I loved him." Then she stopped and looked at me. The pain was deeply etched in her huge brown eyes. She said, "I received the letter while planning our wedding. He said he was very sorry, but he got married. It was so much like Charlie to do something impulsive." She laughed bitterly and said, "He said that the girl he married was much better suited for him." I knew what he was talking about. He could never get over how smart I was. Then the tears started. She said through tears, "I was just devastated. I was useless to everyone, my students, colleagues, and even my family. I thought I knew him, and I couldn't believe that someone I trusted so much could do something so cold and callous." I said as sympathetically as I could, "This is terrible. I'm really sorry." I was not a master of human relations, but it seemed that nothing more could be said. I just sat there patting her on the back, but there was a part of me that wondered how damaged she was. I said, "If you're uncomfortable, we can stop. I don't want to hurt you anymore." She wiped her eyes and looked at me. She seemed to suddenly discover something. She said, "No, actually talking to you made me feel better. I haven't really talked to anyone about it since it happened." I asked, "How long ago was it?" She said, "I received the letter almost exactly a year ago. I started looking for an opportunity to leave Australia immediately after that. I'm only 29 and I wanted to make a complete break with the past. So I decided to start again in this quiet, peaceful place." I said, "Well, I for one am glad you're here." She looked at me lovingly and said, "And I'm glad you are here." Then she laughed and said, "I'm sorry for acting like a whiny woman." I said, "Hey, I'm your friend, and that's what friends are for. I hope to be much more than just a friend, but given Zoe's history, only time will tell." We cleaned everything up after the picnic and took a short walk along the scenic trails. We then returned to the boat and continued to Rocky Point, where we dropped anchor. We finished a bottle of wine while watching the sunset. It was already completely dark when I finished mooring. Zoe was a great boatswain. We drove back to her place in comfortable silence. The day was perfect. We felt especially close and didn't want to break the magic. She didn't invite me in, and I didn't ask. We will have plenty of time for this in the future. So the days passed. We spent all our time together, and eventually she moved in with me. It wasn't anything sexual. She just needed space, and I had 3 bedrooms. So I proposed, and she agreed. There was no need to make rules at this point. I slept in the bedroom on the first floor, and she slept in the one upstairs in the attic. We shared a bathroom, but living with Zoe was like living with a guy. She didn't use all that feminine equipment. Mostly she only had a toothbrush. Of course she wore makeup, but she kept it in her room. And at work, she kept her luxurious, thick brown hair in a long, easy-to-maintain ponytail. At home, she simply let them down to the middle of her back. We lived a comfortable life together, sharing household chores and enjoying each other's company. We went to different places during the work week and went sailing on the weekends. It was an idyllic life, until a couple of months passed after she moved. That Friday morning, I asked her what time she wanted to go out on the boat. She said absolutely calmly, without a hint of anything sinister in her voice, "I can't go sailing this weekend. I have a date." This statement fell on me like a cartoon safe. I said, "Sorry, what did you say? Do you have a date?" She said absently, "Yes, Anthony Picardi invited me to go to town with him. He has tickets to see Wicked tonight." My head exploded. Okay, we never talked about this, but I just assumed that we were exclusive. I admit I wasn't trying to make a deal, but I knew her situation, and given the disastrous end of her last relationship, I didn't want to put pressure on her. And then Picardi just walked in and whisked her off to New York for a weekend of fun and sex. Incredible. I tried to keep my voice under control, but I probably sounded like I was choking. I said, "How long has this been going on?" She said, conversationally, "Well, he's been inviting me since I arrived. I don't really like him. That's why I refused him all the time. But I really want to see this show. I don't know what he's expecting, but if it's anything other than dinner and a show, he'll be disappointed." Fine, I had to say it. I said, trying to sound less desperate than I felt, "This guy is the biggest ladies' man on campus. He slept with half the staff and most of the students. If he's taking you to town, he's expecting a lot more than a goodnight kiss." She said, laughing, "Oh, he'll get way more than a kiss. I'm just not going to give him everything at once. I don't sleep with anyone on the first date." Then she went to her room, laughing at my impudence, believing that she would give it to someone. I was left sitting there with my eyes wide open like Willie the Coyote when he realizes he's run over the edge of a cliff. I thought, oh my God, she doesn't understand at all. She has no idea what she just did to me. I didn't know what to do next. I never said a word about how I felt. How did I really feel? I knew for sure that I did not want her to share herself with any other man. But I didn't tell her anything about it. I treated her like a friend. What should I do now? I could run upstairs and confess my undying love to her. But that would be the most pathetic thing I could imagine. It is so unmanly to cry in such a situation. So I sat there with a lump in my throat while she made noise, getting ready for her date. She even hummed some Australian tunes as if it didn't matter. But for me, it was important. I understood all this in a blinding flash of insight. A healthy 29-year-old woman lived in my house, and I did not take a single step towards her. Okay, I knew her history of failed relationships and tried to respect her grief. But seriously, 2 months of walking around the house in just a long t-shirt and panties, and I didn't try to molest her. Instead of seeing me as her knight on a white horse, she probably thought I was gay. She came down at that moment. I sat on the couch, trying to look calm. There was nothing that could be done now, at least not looking like an insecure coward. But my calm behavior was a complete show. Inside, I was a seething cauldron of undiluted jealousy, and she blew me away. I've never seen her dressed to kill. My Australian boatmate wore a classic little black dress. It was so tight-fitting to her body that it accentuated her narrow waist, compact hips, and bulbous ass. and it was so short that it showed off her gorgeous legs. The front had a cutout decorated with pearls and a slightly unexpectedly large hollow on the chest. But what almost killed me was her face. She usually doesn't wear a lot of makeup. Therefore, I could not even imagine how beautiful she could be. But she was going to town, so she looked impressive. She rocked those gorgeous eyes. They alone would be enough to destroy me. But her lips are something incredible, and she highlighted them. They are so sexy. And to top it all off, she was wearing some exotic perfume that evoked thoughts of wild drum beats, dancing flames, and depraved jungle rituals. She looked at me with deep feeling, made a slight turn on her 4-inch heels, and said, with surprising uncertainty, "What do I look like?" Crap. It was as if she had asked a friend. I sat there dumbfounded, my mouth working like a fish just out of water. I think she saw the apocalyptic suffering in my eyes, because she hurried towards me, looking very worried. She said anxiously, "Jonathan, what happened?" I should have told her. I absolutely should have told her then, but my stupid pride wouldn't let me. I know it's a cop-out, but the dynamics were wrong. This is a man's thing. I just couldn't look like a weakling in front of Picardy. So I pulled myself together and told her the most pointless thing imaginable. "Well, I'm just upset that we're not going sailing this weekend." She smiled at me lovingly and even ran her hand over my cheek. She said, "There are still a lot of weekends left. We just need to plan better." I thought, better plan? Fuck you and the lawyer you arrived in. This disaster was not caused by poor planning. It was a complete failure of communication. I made a bunch of stupid assumptions. I got it all wrong. And now I was forced to sit here while this jackal carried away the love of my life. It's not her fault. She clearly had needs, and I treated her like a roommate. Well, she and was my roommate, but it was temporary until I got to her heart and her panties. What the hell? How stupid was that? This is not a damn Jane Austen novel. At that moment, the doorbell rang. She hurried to open the door, and there, in all his fat glory, stood Anthony Picardy. Okay, he was younger, prettier, and a little bigger than me, and he had money. But who's counting? He was a complete nobody on campus, an assistant registrar, but his family was rich. But they were spent just like everyone else. He gave me his usual condescending grin and said, "Jonathan, my man, how are you?" Okay, he didn't make James Bond. I didn't mean to fall on my face. I dryly said, "Great, man. And you?" He put his arm around Zoe's waist, gave her a lustful look, and said something subtle like, "After tonight, it will be even better." Then he turned and led her away. She blew me a kiss as she was casually dragged out onto the porch. I got up and closed the door. As I did this, I saw the bastard helping her into his Corvette, his grin outshone the streetlights. There are moments in life that you will remember forever. This was one of them. I was surprised that I didn't die on the spot. Every system in my body was on edge, blood pressure, heart rate, and I was ready to shit myself and vomit on the living room carpet. I wandered over to our couch and sat down with my head in my hands. How could I stand forever until she came home? I was going to explain this misunderstanding to her as soon as she returned, and this will be completely clear. It was one thing to be surprised by the unexpected shock that would make December 7th, 1941, a quiet Sunday afternoon on Oahu. But it's another thing entirely to let it happen again. I was going to make sure this farce would end as soon as she got home. Zoe was a grown woman and had every right to accept an invitation to something fun. I heard Wicked was a great show, not that I could afford to take her to it. But all the same, if she goes somewhere with Picardy again after I clear, I'll express our feelings for her. Then we will know exactly where we are, and we will each go our own way. I couldn't concentrate while the clock was ticking. I walked back and forth and tried to read. It was a joke. I didn't turn on the TV. I just sat there, staring into space, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. The clock was ticking. It was approaching midnight. They had left more than 6 hours ago when a cheerful message arrived. It read, "I'll stay in the city. "Do not wait for me," and it had a kiss emoji attached to it. Oh, how wonderful this is. They rented a damn room. I thought I had suffered before. I didn't even climb the foothills. It was like my heart was a trailer park and Zoe was a tornado. Rightly, according to my sensations, numb with pain, all this agony turned into rage. Anger is a primal instinct. He protects you and motivates you to fight. But anger is also blind. Therefore, it almost guarantees that your next action will be the stupidest one. I spent an almost sleepless night staring at the ceiling and planning my revenge. If I weren't a coward, I would just hold out until we talked. Instead, I chose to give the prostitute a taste of her own medicine, show her how it feels. All subsequent events occurred because of this one bad choice. I even understood that I was behaving childishly. My rational brain told me that trying to get revenge on Zoe was absurd. She acted like any normal attractive woman, even if her taste in men was a little questionable. The fact was that she had no idea how I felt about her, and the poor girl was probably just as sexually unsatisfied as I was. However, my lizard brain told me that I was completely humiliated. I saw it in Picardi's eyes. There is no need to point out how childish this idea was. Zoe has done nothing to disrespect me other than go on a date with that creep. Okay, the choice of gentleman left much to be desired. But he was also the only one who actually asked her out, unlike me. However, I still felt like I had to get my pride back. So at exactly 8:30 I picked up the phone, and he called Alice Withers. She is the dean's secretary, and Alice has already made it clear that she is ready to meet with me anytime and anywhere. I never thought to take her up on her offer. In my opinion, she was very stupid, and I was sure that I would get the best communication from Buster. But if my Zoe could spend a sweaty night in a Manhattan hotel with that womanizer, then I could put up with Alice for 24 hours. She was delighted. I said, "Alice, I was thinking about you, and I wanted to ask if you wanted to go on a sailboat to Port Jefferson and have some fun. Shall we come back on Sunday evening?" Port Jefferson is where the Connecticut ferry docks, and it has the kind of whimsical atmosphere that a girl like Alice would love. She squealed with joy and said, "What time will you pick me up? So much for playing hard to get." I said, "How about in an hour? Take something for the night." Okay, now I was in deep trouble, and he already began to doubt his decisions. But I went after her anyway. She lived in a cheap apartment complex in the north of the city. I knocked on her door, and she opened it as if she was waiting for me behind it. She was wearing a slightly tight t-shirt that hugged her huge breasts at least double D's, maybe more like M's or Z's. Her shorts were almost like panties. She put her arms around my neck and kissed me. This happened exactly 10 seconds into the date. God knows what will happen in the next 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 50 seconds. I carefully pulled away and said, "Wow, are you ready?" She giggled and said, "Ready for anything, big boy." The meaning of this statement was clear. The voice in my head, and I think it's my mom, slapped her forehead and said, "Oh my God, this is such a bad idea." But I was gallant to the point of madness, so I took Alice and her rolling suitcase and headed out to the boat. Unlike Alice, Zoe travels with a fabric backpack. Alice chatted all the way about things she read on the internet. This is her version of being informed. It was the usual celebrity bullshit that I can't stand. We followed the sound, and Alice went into the cabin to change into a swimsuit. I use this term loosely because she walked out wearing something that consisted of two small squares. The whole thing was held on by strings that looked like dental floss and which threatened to break due to the movement of her massive breasts. It was quite a performance. She asked cheerfully, "Can I sunbathe?" I said, "Of course, just spread the blanket over the bow." I thought, thank God I won't have to talk to her. She carefully walked along the side of the cabin and onto the foredeck, spread out a towel, and lay down on it. She then removed what could be considered her top. We had good wind, and I supplemented it with motors, so we were sailing at almost 12 knots. This cut the usual 4-hour journey down to 3. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I received a call. I had just rounded Old Field Point and was heading down the narrow peninsula to the entrance to Port Jefferson Harbor. A cheerful Australian voice said, "I'm home, where are you?" I answered just as cheerfully, "I'm on a boat, just like I said. I'll be back tomorrow." At this moment, Alice, who has not a single bone of tact, asked loudly, "Who is it, Jonathan?" There was a long pause at the other end of the line. Zoe then said with a broken voice, "Is there a woman with you?" I replied with deliberate nonchalance, "Yes, I didn't want to go out alone, and Alice Withers volunteered to go with me. We're just going to have fun in Port Jeff, and we'll be back as soon as possible tomorrow." Zoe knew I was with the female equivalent of her date last night. I realized what I was doing. Actually, I planned it this way. But as it turned out, instead of experiencing great pleasure, as I thought, it was simply killing me. You could hear a pin drop on the other end of the line. Zoe then said with a broken voice, "Well, have fun," and I heard the start of a quiet sob as she hung up. We moored at the public docks at the bottom of Port Jefferson Harbor and walked up Main Street to a few dance clubs nearby. It was evening, and everything began to come to life. Alice was again wearing a t-shirt and short shorts. The local predatory community showed interest in her. I thought I felt terrible before, but now I was devastated. Alice was completely unaware, of course. I ordered a pitcher of beer, and we sat down at a table. She immediately started dancing on the spot. She looked at me questioningly. I said, "I don't dance." She was trying to get me on the dance floor when some guy who looked like a ferry worker from Bridgeport came up and asked her out. She looked at me and I said, "Please." For the next 3.5 hours, Alice drank and danced with her partners. A group of 4 strong guys poured her drinks. I watched her get drunker and more promiscuous as the evening went on. As I sat there, all I felt was emptiness. Zoe went on a date. I've moved to a new level. I didn't think this was the end of the match, and I didn't expect a blowback. Meanwhile, Alice disappeared. I didn't care who she might be with, but I felt responsible, so I went to look for her. A voice in my head, perhaps it was my mother, shook its head in disgust and said, "You're such a damn noble, arrogant fool." I approached the battered Chevrolet van, remaining in the shadows. Eventually, I found Alice with 4 men. I'm not a hero, but I brought her here, so I had to do something. I wasn't going to get into a fight with 4 strong workers for the sake of Alice's dubious honor. But I could call 911 from the old bar phone and report a disturbance in the parking lot. I was standing in the shadows when the patrol car arrived. The guys ran away. She found the strength to get dressed and run to the bar. She wasn't as drunk as I thought. I intercepted her before she reached the back door. I led her around to the side of the building and straight down the street to the boat. I could hear screams behind me as the cops tried to catch the guys she was with. I took her straight to the back of the cabin and put her in the tiny cabin. She tried to pester me. But I said, "Not today, Alice. You've already had enough sex for one evening." She must have felt the delayed effects of the alcohol, because she fell into the bed and then she immediately started snoring. All in all, this could have been the strangest night of my life. It was midnight, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. Alice was pushing me away. I was completely fed up with revenge, and I wanted to talk to Zoe. Night sailing on Long Island Sound can be dangerous, especially with the shoals, reefs, and ocean shipping traffic from New York. But I needed to get home. I had to get my life back, for both better and worse. And it starts with a conversation I was going to have with Zoe. I untied the boat and motored toward Oyster Bay. The panorama of stars overhead and the peace and quiet of the Sound began to bring me into perspective. It's really no one's fault. Couples need the strength and confidence of human intimacy to cope with life's challenges. And Zoe is by far the best friend and companion you could ever imagine. But intimacy is a binary state, and psychological intimacy is only one dimension. The other half is sexual intimacy. Usually, the physical part comes first. I mean, guys don't sit at a bar nudging each other and saying, "Look at that girl's personality." Their interests are much more down to earth and aimed a little below the belt. Therefore, most relationships begin with the physical side and then move into more complex, long-term emotions such as love and respect. The problem was that Zoe and I immediately hit it off. We almost instantly became as close as two people can be, and that instant chemistry was what threw me off. Our rapport would usually lead to something carnal. I mean, I'm a guy, for God's sake, but I knew Zoe's story, and he just assumed that she was fragile. I didn't want to lose her, so I played it safe. As it turns out, this was an incredibly stupid strategy. Any idiot should have realized that a woman as attractive as Zoe wouldn't sit on a shelf while I tried to be a knight. But I was too damn naive, or perhaps too arrogant, to realize it. And as a result, at dawn I walked past Center Island to my pier, not knowing what awaited me at home. The logical scenario was to find them both at breakfast, looking tired. Maybe I deserve it, because it was I who took extreme measures. I was angry at Zoe for letting the dirty lady's man get the better of her, but I never thought they would do anything other than regular sex. Bringing Alice Withers anywhere was like announcing that you were going to do the dirtiest things that even Caligula would envy. Alice was actually a very good and efficient secretary during the day, but she was legendary for what she did and who she did it with after work. Zoe knew this. Damn it, the entire NASA district knew this, and I was ashamed. Not because I betrayed Zoe. This was a different kind of pain. I was ashamed to have joined the legion of men who became Alice's legend, even if I never touched her. Speaking of Alice, she was snoring when I started the boat. God help me, I really thought about it. She is a beautiful woman with an insane body. But I also knew where it would lead, and I didn't want to catch something contagious. After all, she had just had sex with 4 strong men. Instead, I tried to wake her up. This required ingenuity. She was really, really sound asleep. I shook her shoulder, saying, "Alice, wake up." All I got from her was loud snoring. Her mouth opened, and she fell asleep again, with a small string of saliva running down her cheek. I dragged her across the cot so I could reach her hands and lift her to her feet. I thought she would probably wake up if I put her on her feet. Bad idea. She was as limp as the famous wet noodles. She woke up, returning to reality. I was ready to take her home. She said, "Wow, that was amazing, baby." I wondered what she thought we had done. She was probably half asleep most of the time. Maybe she just assumed I had sex with her. She said, "Let me get cleaned up and changed, and I'll be with you, lover." The last word made me want to run away. I went out onto the aft deck, closing the hatch, and I seriously considered going back down for the day. I knew Alice would be more than happy to oblige, but I was thinking about what awaits me with Zoya. I imagined Zoe having sex with the bastard. This picture caused a bolt of jealousy in me, and that's enough got cold so I can focus on what needs to be done. Alice came out 20 minutes later, almost normally dressed. She was wearing a slightly tight t-shirt, but given the huge contrast between her chest and her huge breasts, I could understand how difficult it would be to find something suitable. She completed the outfit with very tight jeans. All the way Alice chatted about what a wonderful time she had and what a wonderful lover I was. I didn't know if she was really that stupid or if she was playing with me. I never officially touched this bitch, and the highlight of her trip was sex in a rusty old van. Maybe this is what Alice thought was fun. I dropped her off at the door. She wanted me to come in, but I said I had things I absolutely had to do at home. I didn't lie. I needed to talk to Zoe right now. She looked disappointed, but her last words gave me chills. She said, "We have to do this again soon, lover." I put on a polite face and said, "I'll call you." I hoped that the campus was large enough that I could hide until this very blow healed. I approached my house with anxiety. The red Picardy Corvette was not parked in the driveway, which was a good sign. I almost hoped Zoe wouldn't be home. I didn't sleep for almost 2 days. And to put it mildly, I was not in the best shape, so I wanted to get some sleep. But if she was home, I needed to work things out for better or worse. I stopped at the door and gathered my courage to open it. I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and entered my house. Zoe lay on the couch with a rope wrapped around her strong little body, and Buster slept peacefully on the floor next to her. Her thick brown hair was a mess. Her face looked gaunt, and her sleeping posture was far from relaxed. She looked like an angel, my angel. Buster stirred and said accusingly in his slow southern drawl, "You're home at last, boss." He then got up and walked into the bathroom, where I heard him drinking loudly from the toilet. I tried for years to break him of this habit, but he says it's an important part of his morning awakening like coffee is for me. The noise of Buster drinking woke Zoe. She stirred and slowly opened her eyes. It took her a few seconds to realize where she was. She then focused on me standing there. The look of pain and betrayal struck me. It was clear that I had just joined her ex-fiancé as the main traitor. She said with suppressed anger in her voice, "Did you and Alice have a good time?" I looked at her with all the love I felt, and he said in the calmest voice he could muster, "You and I have suffered from a catastrophic lack of communication, and it caused a lot of pain. I want to end this now." She looked puzzled. I kept saying, "I don't know how you feel about our relationship, and I want to know this as soon as possible. But as far as I'm concerned, I want to lay all my cards on the table." Without saying a word, she swung her legs off the sofa, stood up, and went to the kitchen. I heard her rattling around there, preparing coffee. The whole world thinks that Australians drink tea just like the British. But the younger generation, like Zoe, are all coffee lovers. I followed her. Her body language indicated that she was very angry. She looked at me. Her eyes were red. She cried. My opinion of myself dropped even lower. She frowned, picked up the coffee pot, and said, "Coffee?" I nodded and sat down. She placed a mug of this wonderful restorative drink in front of me. I enjoyed the aroma. She sat down and just looked at me. Okay, I realized that the ball is in my court. The roughly 6-year-old part of me wanted to ask her how many times she'd slept with the bastard. But luckily, my slightly more emotionally mature self said, "It all started because I never told you how I really felt about you." She looked stunned. I continued, "I love you. I loved you from the first day we met. I took it slow because I thought you needed time to get over Charlie. Of course, just assuming something without asking you is quite arrogant, isn't it?" I added sadly, "I'd like to think you wouldn't have slept with Picardy if I'd told you how I felt about you. But I didn't say it, and you did." Now she looked dumbfounded. I said, "Friday night I was imagining you two having sex in some fancy hotel in New York, and it was killing me. So I pulled this little trick on Alice to get revenge." Her eyes hardened, but she continued to listen. I said, "I chose her because in my mind she is no different from Picardy, and I thought she would be the perfect candidate to prove my point." Now she looked very angry. I said, "The problem is that I knew I was being dishonest. You didn't know I loved you, did you?" She blurted out, "Of course not. You acted like my gay friend. I walked around practically naked for 2 months straight, and you kept making witty comments about work. What was I supposed to think?" I smiled at this and said in a conciliatory tone, "Well, if it's any consolation, my date with Alice was a complete failure. On the way there, she chatted to such an extent that I thought about pulling her overboard. Then, when we arrived in Port Jeff, she got blackout drunk and had sex with strangers. I loaded her lifeless body onto the boat and headed straight home. That's why I came back so early." I added with a weak smile, "By the way, I want you to know that she slept the whole way back. I didn't even take off my clothes." This was technically true, and at this point, I didn't think it would be wise to go into detail. Then I added with a conciliatory smile, "Well, to be fair, I did get a welcome kiss when I picked her up." Then I got serious. "But I swear to God that for the last 48 hours, all I've been thinking about is you and how I needed to tell you how I felt." I added sincerely, "It may be too late, but if you accept me, I want to be your devoted and only lover, and someday your husband." Her big brown eyes filled with tears. "Women," she said, "I just hated you for the last 12 hours. Against all my best intentions, I allowed myself to fall in love with you. And then you betrayed this love by spending the weekend with this woman of easy virtue." Then she started sobbing and said, "What was I supposed to think? I didn't know how you felt about me. If only you had told me, even hinted, that you wanted me. If I thought there was even the slightest chance that we would end up together, I would never go on a date with this man." Then her face hardened and she said, "I know what you're thinking. Yes, I spent the night with him. But no, I didn't do everything he wanted. I don't let myself down on the first date. This is a matter of personal pride. Isn't that what I told you when I left?" I nodded in recognition. She continued, "I am a very passionate and experienced lover. I can make any man happy. And believe me, Tony Picardi was a very happy man when he dropped me off yesterday." I understand. I hated it. But I understood. But the fact remained, it didn't really matter. We made no promises to each other except the unspoken ones. And we weren't technically a couple when this happened. We were best friends for a long time. But friendship is not the same as commitment. In fact, I could have sex with Alice while hanging from a mast without actually breaking any rules of engagement. More important is how she felt about our relationship in the future. So I asked her directly. I said, "Okay, now you know exactly how I feel. I want to have an exclusive relationship with you, and someday be your husband, rejecting all others when you are ready. If this is not what you want, we will part on better terms, because I can't survive another day off like this." I added, "However, if you want me as much as I want you, I need to hear it from you. Are we heading towards marriage, or are we going our separate ways?" In response, she gave me the most intense look I've ever seen from a woman. She silently stood up and walked towards the bedroom on the first floor. She shed her robe along the way. She had a nice little body. I stood there stunned, and as usual, he did nothing. This has been my problem all this time with Zoe. So she stepped forward, smiling with feminine confidence. My brain finally turned on. We made love. She opened one cheerful eye and said with wry humor, "In case you haven't realized, I think we're on our way to marriage." This broke the ice. We spent the whole day making love. Meanwhile, we talked, laughed, and ate Chinese takeout. Then she looked at me lovingly and said, "I thought I had lost the joy of giving myself completely to someone." Then she thought for a moment and said, "Until today. But now I know the secret. I have to feel completely betrayed and in love before I can let myself go. And I have to thank you for helping me understand this." This answered my other question. She wasn't lying about Friday night. I mentally breathed a sigh of relief. Unfortunately, it was a little premature. We were two people in love when we went to class on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, we were exchanging shots across the demilitarized zone. I don't know exactly when she got her story, but I know when I got mine. Zoe taught a 3-hour lab on Cisco on Monday. I only had a 2-hour lecture, so I usually met her in the student union. So I was sitting in Starbucks when Picardi walked in. He looked more smug and confident than ever. He noticed me, gave me his most arrogant grin, and headed towards my table. I was preparing for what I knew would be an unpleasant encounter. I turned off the laptop, closed the screen, and looked at him with what I hoped was neutral interest on my face, rather than the disgust I was feeling. He was completely full of himself. He looked me over with his usual grin and said, "I needed to come and tell you what a great time I had having sex with your roommate." He began to tell the dirty details of their evening. He then chuckled and said, "By the way, just so you know, I plan to connect with her again next Friday. But this time, maybe we can go straight to my place. I know she'll want to jump right into what makes her happy." Then he delivered the killing blow. "It must be hard to live with someone so hot who won't let you have sex with her. You stink." With that, he gave me one last grin, stood up and walked towards the barista. This completely threw me off track. I just sat there frozen. I'm not aggressive, but I swear I would have gone for that bastard. Only the enormous burden of suffering that he had just dumped on me pinned me to the chair. My rational mind was sure he was trolling me. I knew from day one that he hated me. I was a rising star among teachers, and he was carrying papers in the registration office. I mean, a man doesn't start out in life planning to become a highly skilled secretary. But what raised my blood pressure was his absolute confidence. Nobody says that unless there is at least some fire underneath the smoke. The problem was that Zoe had given me her solemn promise that he would never touch her in that way. So what did she do? We made no commitments to each other. Consequently, at that moment, she had not violated any moral boundaries with the possible exception of the rules of good taste. I still didn't know how I would react if Zoe told me that she let that creep actually have sex with her. I knew from personal experience that this was part of her arsenal, but the story Picardi told me just didn't ring true. This person was simply not the Zoe I knew. So I was a mass of confused emotions when Zoe showed up. She was wearing one of those tartan wrap skirts that preppy girls love, a classic navy blue quarter-zip sweater with the obligatory cotton shirt underneath, bare feet and knee-high socks. She was great. With her thick brown hair in a short ponytail and her perfectly oval face, I knew I had a rare gem, one that I didn't want to lose, although I thought about killing her. She quickly approached me with fire in her eyes. I thought, what the hell is this? She stood in front of me, seething with anger. Through clenched teeth, she said, "We have to talk now, mister," and she walked away in the direction of the parking lot. We arrived on campus in the same car. So when she walked past me in my car, I knew my world had turned upside down. I called a taxi. Long Island is not a city, so it took a while. When I entered the house, she was packing the last of her things into her old Land Rover Defender. At the same time, she cried bitterly. I thought that I was the one who was supposed to be evil, not her. But she seemed completely beside herself with rage. I stood and watched as she stuffed the last things in. I said with less irritation than I felt, "I'm here. Let's talk." She turned to me and began to openly sob, covering her face with her hands. I was completely puzzled. Why did I feel as if it was my fault? I was deceived, not her. I went into the house. Buster met me looking concerned. I said, "I don't know what's going on, buddy. The whole floor is like that." At that moment, she walked past me and headed towards the kitchen table. I followed her slowly. I had a sudden thought. It seemed like every 24 hours we were going from crap to luxury and back again, sitting in the same two chairs. I looked at her in bewilderment. She said, "Alice specifically looked for me as soon as I arrived on campus. So, what do you have to say in your defense now, you bastard?" She used Australian pronunciation. I think it has a little more meaning in their language. I was stunned. I said, "So Alice was looking for you, and what?" This should have calmed me down if Zoe's behavior hadn't been so strange. But her behavior began to scare me. She slammed her hand on the table and said, "She told me about all the sex you had at her house, and on the boat it was a list of debauchery. Seriously? You were supposed to have sex with her and then come back and do the same to me?" And she began to sob loudly. Okay, I got it, to some extent. Alice went out of her way to weave a story for Zoe. This was probably a preemptive attack aimed at knocking Zoe out of the game. And it seemed that Alice had achieved success, exceeding all her expectations. I actually didn't think this bitch was that smart. I was damn angry. I didn't need this shitty circus, especially after what Picardi just said to me. Sometimes I feel like God is using me as his personal punching bag. I said with extreme bitterness, "Trust me, if I had known how much fun you had with Picardi that night, I would not have made love to you." She looked stunned. Not guilty, just completely puzzled. She said with confusion in her voice, "What are you talking about?" I continued, "The only thing I did to Alice was drag her naked body out of the cot on Sunday morning after she had fallen asleep there the night before." I added, All that stupid bitch did was roll around in a thong, drink too much, and have sex with a bunch of drunk rednecks. I can't imagine how she found time for additional debauchery. I looked at Zoe intently and said, "Of course, from what Picardi told me, you were no less busy than she was. I don't know why you felt the need to lie to me about this. But seriously, Zoe, 5 times? How did you have any energy left for Sunday, or are you just such a big woman of easy virtue?" Now she looked really puzzled. She said, "Picardi told you what?" I told her his story verbatim. She turned purple with rage. She screamed, "You are lying. You're just making this up to justify your actions this weekend, you moron." Then she stood up, ran out the door, started her car, and roared out of the driveway, throwing gravel all over the front yard. I looked at Buster. He looked at me and said, "That didn't go over very well, did it, boss?" Alice worked a regular schedule from 9 to 5. I thought the dean might be upset if I strangled his secretary right in front of him, so I had to wait until Alice came home. And I will wait. Meanwhile, I called Zoe a couple dozen times. I was starting to smell the fat little Italian rat and wanted to talk to her one last time. I was hoping that when she cooled down, we could work things out. But either her phone was turned off or she was ignoring me. I was sitting in the parking lot of Alice's complex when she pulled up in her little Ford Fiesta. She was dressed for work, a white rayon blouse, a modest gray skirt, and a matching jacket. She has a very cute face with short curly blonde hair, and if you knew nothing about her nocturnal exploits, you would find her very attractive. She started walking towards her apartment, completely unaware that I was in hot pursuit. I caught up with her as she was taking her keys out of her bag. She turned around, surprised, and then she gave me a long, slow, lustful smile. She said seductively, "Good evening, lover. Let me change into something more comfortable." She then opened the door and walked straight to her bedroom without closing it. I had to do it. Apparently, more comfortable meant a robe, and nothing else. It was obvious from the way everything moved underneath him. I was sitting on her couch when she returned. She gave me a very hot look and sat down next to me. I had a plan. I knew the prospect of sex would force Alice to blab, so I looked into her very lustful eyes and said in a flirtatious tone, "Who told you to talk to Zoe?" She answered without the slightest hesitation, "Of course, Tony Picardi." It was as if Alice and I were in on a little joke together. I playfully shook my finger at her and said, "You little wretch, why did Tony ask you to do something so bad?" She liked how events unfolded. She became mischievous and said, "He came right after you dropped me off. He asked how our weekend was." A haze crossed her face as she said, "I told him we didn't really do anything except flirt a little at the end. I told him I thought you might like men." Then she said quite artlessly, "He explained why you are so reserved. He told me about your roommate and how bossy she is. And he said you and I would be a perfect match if I just cut her out of your life." Oh, that's what he said, right? She continued, not noticing my reaction. There was anger in her voice. "I know what these academic women are like. They think they're smarter than everyone else. They don't respect anyone. They have to control everything." I understand. Most of the women on the teaching staff looked down on Alice. It was because of her appearance and her reputation. Alice hid her indignation, but it must have hurt her. Then she perked up. "Tony said I should do you a big favor and tell your bitchy roommate what a great time we had this weekend." She smiled slyly. "He told me to make something up, and the juicier the better." She giggled cheerfully. "So I told your bitchy neighbor." She squealed joyfully. "And look, it worked. The way your neighbor reacted, I'm sure she's gone forever. She was really mad." I thought, incredible. He should be hanged for taking advantage of the naive. It was obvious that both Zoe and I had been set up, and I was going to return everything with interest and penalties. Meanwhile, Alice was looking at me with the most lustful look, as if in her mind the next logical step was to the bedroom. After all, I wasn't mad at her. I wanted to kill Picardy, but she was innocent. Or as innocent as a stupid prostitute like her could be. I almost felt sorry for her. I looked at her sadly and said, Picardy lied to you, Alice. Zoe and I have been together as a couple for several months now. But he wants to get Zoe into bed. He must know she has betrayal issues. So he used your fake story to piss her off enough to make her leave and possibly to him. Alice looked dumbfounded. She said with amazement in her voice, but he told me she was a bitch. Why did you take me on your boat, then, if you two were together? I smiled at her kindly. She thought that all she had to do was kiss enough frogs, and she would get a fairy tale ending. Therefore, she was ready to sleep with anyone in pants. Oh, I knew she really enjoyed the process. I was a direct witness to this. But oddly enough, you didn't have to dig very deep to see that there was a certain childlike naivety about Alice. She was just simple-minded. If she were thin and plain, people would ignore her rather than use her. But because of her appearance, people used her for their own purposes. I said as sympathetically as possible, it was a misunderstanding. Zoe and I worked it out after I returned. I'm sorry, Alice. We really had a good time. But Zoe is the woman of my life. Alice looked devastated. She began to sob. I said, what happened? She said, I've never felt this way about a man. I thought, oh damn, she's falling in love with me. My instinct to have sex or run was to throw my hands up and run screaming into the parking lot. Instead, chivalrous to a fault, I told her that any man would be happy to have her as his wife. I didn't add that to do this, he would need to pick up an indestructible chastity belt. Then I said that I had a lecture to prepare for, so I have to go. She said hopefully, will you come back? I looked at her sitting there with that gorgeous body. I thought, if Zoe doesn't come to her senses, maybe I'll come back. Alice may be stupid, but at least she doesn't have any bats in her tower. So I said, we'll see. But at that moment, I had more important things to do. I kind of suspected where Zoe might have gone. She needed somewhere to sleep, and there was only one other option, so I went to Picardy's house. His place overlooked the golf club at Bethpage Park. The word artsy comes to mind. He earned a third of what I earn, but as I said, his family had money. Zoe was unloading the last of the boxes from her Land Rover. Picardy must have been in the house. I went to her. She said, get out, you bastard. I never want to see you again. I spread my hands in a placating gesture and said, I just came from Alice. Doe, stupid start. Zoya dropped the box, picked out a shoe, and threw it at me. She said furiously, how many times have you had sex with her today, you bastard? I had a desire to put her over my knee, but I controlled my anger and said as calmly as possible, she told me that everything she told you was a lie. Zoe looked puzzled. I paused for dramatic effect and said, and guess who convinced her to do it? She reacted strangely, like she didn't want to hear what I had to say. I said placatingly, can't we call a truce and discuss this? You should at least know the truth. The ass appeared at that moment. He was his usual arrogant self, but perhaps he overheard the latter parts of our conversation, because he was full of bravado. He screamed, get off my property or I'll call the police. I said, seriously, dude, this is a public sidewalk. Then I turned to Zoe and said, Picardy tricked you. Just give me a minute to explain. Alice will confirm all this. She won't lie anymore. She'll tell you what really happened. The idiot looked panicked. He shouted to Zoe, don't listen to him. He's just lying to justify his actions. Have I heard this somewhere before? I'm wondering when Zoe talked to this idiot. Probably right after he talked to me. Which reminds me, I said, he's lying, right? And repeated all his words that he told me about sex with Zoe. Zoya now looked at him, stunned, with understanding slowly emerging in her eyes. It was a classic trick question. Have you stopped beating your wife? If he said, I never had sex with her, which Zoe knew to be true, she wouldn't know he was a lying sack of shit anyway, but of course I would know. What if he said, "Oh, yes," several times? Zoya would have known that he was lying. The idiot tried to solve the problem without saying anything. He stood there, blazing with hatred. Finally, he said, "I won't comment on that." He wasn't very quick with resourceful answers, was he? It didn't even have a chance of success. Zoe looked confused and angry. She said, "Answer him, Tony. Did you tell Jonathan you had sex with me on Friday night?" He said reluctantly, "I may have hinted at something like that. It was for your own good, Zoe. You need to be with someone who has money and style, not this nerd." He stood in the doorway, arms outstretched, pleading. She screamed, "Ah, men." She pulled out a pair of shoes from the box to match the one she had thrown at me and threw them at the idiot. He ducked, and the shoe flew past his head and into the house. The girl had a grip. She then turned to me and said guiltily, "Is my room still free?" I said, "I haven't passed it yet, but we will need to talk before I take the ad down." She said, "Okay, I'll see you at home in half an hour." And she started repacking her car. She arrived home 25 minutes after me. The delay was long enough for her to pack everything up and give her opinion to the idiot. She began to carry her things back into her room. She looked strange, almost upset. I took the box and followed her. When I got up, she was sitting on the bed and crying. She said through tears, "How can you forgive me?" I put the box down, walked over, sat on the bed, and put my arm around her shoulders. They were shaking with sobs. I said, "I talked to Alice. She told me everything she told you. I know you have issues with betrayal in your past, and your reaction to her story is completely consistent with that experience. It's hard to trust any man after what Charlie did to you." I said, "Alice is not really a bad person. She's just stupid and easily manipulated. Picardi was the one who convinced her to lie to you, because he knew how you would react." She looked at me carefully and said, "How do you think I reacted?" Okay, I didn't thought about that, did I? I said with increasing fear, "I don't know. You were very angry when you left, and it took me several hours to find Alice and get a confession out of her." I began to draw conclusions, and I didn't like where it was leading. I said with pain in my voice, "I was hoping you went somewhere to cool off." But I knew what she really did. Zoe was just as stubborn as I was. In her head, I would have completely betrayed her trust. That is, if she believed Alice. So her first thought would be revenge. And I knew exactly who she would choose for this. A cataclysm occurred in my head. It was like two planets colliding. I said with all the pain concentrated in the one super hot black hole in my heart, "You didn't do it, did you?" She began to sob loudly, turned around and lay face down on the bed, pounding the mattress with her fist. I thought, the game, the set, and the match are up to Mr. Picardi. The sense of loss was overwhelming. I thought, I'll have to take enough time to come up with a suitable plan. But when I do, it will be a scorched earth, a war to the last. I slowly got out of bed and took the box. I tried to appear dignified as I walked outside to her car. I went back upstairs. She lay in the same position as before, sobbing in agony. She sat up, tears streaming down her face. She said pleadingly, "Please, it was a mistake. I was deceived, just like you." I said, "It was not a mistake. It was a carefully planned and deliberately executed act of revenge." She began to cry, bursting into tears. "I've never loved anyone the way I love you. That's why I acted so stupidly." I really believed her. Her history with men and her passionate nature led her to this. Zoe is an intelligent and usually practical woman. Her sanity must have been greatly shaken if she gave herself up to this slippery guy. I felt pleased by the irony of the situation. It must be truly excruciating to realize that your downfall was planned by the guy you just slept with. But I did a poor job of hiding my broken heart when I said, "I'm going to the boat. Please close the door when you leave." And I closed the door on the best thing that happened to me in my miserable average life. I wasn't actually going on the boat. I had something much more satisfying planned revenge, so I went back to Alice. Yes, I know that she is a woman of easy virtue, but I wanted to start the game as soon as possible. Alice was the real reason for my suffering, and I wanted an advance for what she did to me. I didn't mean to offend her. Mostly, I wanted revenge, and knowing her, I was absolutely sure that the information would quickly reach Zoe. I hoped it would hurt her as much as it hurt me. She was delighted. She was still wearing the same robe. She opened the door with a smile. We had sex. She said, "Wow, lover, what was that?" I said, "I just wanted you to know that while I was waiting for you, Zoe had sex with your fat friend Picardi out of revenge. So I'm done with her, and she's moving out." Alice looked stunned. She said with real anguish in her voice, "Did I really cause this?" Okay, she's a woman of mild intelligence, but there didn't seem to be an evil bone in her body. I said, perhaps a little cruelly, definitely yes. I put on pants and a t-shirt while saying this. She said, almost crying, "Is there anything I can do to make it up to you?" I said, "Probably not." As I turned to leave, she started crying. She sobbed, "Does this mean I'll never see you again?" As I walked out the door, I said, "It depends." I was done with romance, but that didn't mean I was done with sex. I knew I would be back for more. Zoe was not there when I returned. She left me a note. It said, "I've been a fool, and I'm yours if you can ever forgive me. I'll stay away from you, and please stay away from me. It just hurts too much." Well, okay, I did not care. I was now a robot completely devoid of feelings. The students hated it because I was no longer an easy target for their sad stories. I saw Zoe several times at meetings. We avoided looking into each other's eyes. I heard she's renting a small apartment in Farmingdale. I was glad that she moved on. I haven't heard anything about the men in her life, but I never talked to anyone about her. Finally, the end of the semester arrived. I was on a merciless crusade, day and night. Obsession is a very negative state, but it does focus your thinking. Every time I saw Picardi, he grinned. Perhaps he slept with Zoya, who knows? More importantly, who cares? He couldn't touch me. But I was going to touch Picardi so as to even the score, and then move on. I don't belong to a social class that solves things by beating people up. This may be short-term gratification even if I were capable of it, and I might even avoid jail. But the thing is, I like to give a gift that keeps on giving. I want my revenge to be a gift that the recipient will remember for the rest of their pathetic life. Alice was sitting at her table, looking formal and professional when I came to meet with the dean. If you only saw her at work, you would think that she is the most correct and efficient secretary in the world. She interacts with people who come to the dean's office very coldly and reservedly, almost aloof, both in person and on the phone. And sitting at her large secretarial desk with all the modern equipment, which she operated like a seasoned professional, she was an incredibly beautiful, almost magnetic woman. I heard that she was constantly harassed by all the men who passed by the office. But rumors say that she is an ice queen at work. There were also rumors that the dean was sleeping with her, which wasn't completely impossible given her specific tastes. But there has never been anything concrete to confirm this. I expected a friendly greeting since I had been with her most of the night before. But she smiled modestly and pointed to a chair. She said, "The dean will see you soon." Then, when the phone light came on, she stood up, straightened her skirt, and walked into his office. Even in a jacket and tight skirt, the view was stunning. I heard voices, and she came back looking primly. She said, "The dean will see you." The dean reminded me of a weasel, small, thin, almost sinuous, with a sharp nose and small, sparkling eyes. He said, "How can I help you, Jonathan?" The tone was tinged with boredom. I said, "I have evidence of serious misconduct by one of your employees, which could lead to a sexual harassment claim." This brought him out of his state of boredom. Those small, sparkling eyes focused on me with intensity. Any case of this nature would be a PR disaster, and depending on the circumstances, could even threaten his own position. I said, "Here are 4 notarized affidavits that I have collected. They are from 4 female students and all relate to the actions of Antonio Picardi, who is an assistant in the registrar's office." If the dean had a mustache, I would have seen it twitch. Instead, his eyes narrowed. He may have heard some rumors about Picardi. He also probably knew my history with this scoundrel. The dean said, "Very strange behavior on your part, Jonathan. Why would you bring up such a problem?" He knew perfectly well why, but he tested my resolve. I said, quite seriously, although I was blatantly lying, "One student came to me upset. She couldn't enroll in the course she needed, and Mr. Picardi used his influence to get her into this course." The dean's eyes continued to narrow, so I added, "But he also forced her into a sexual relationship in exchange, and then threatened to tell her parents when she tried to stop it. It's all in this statement, and I gave him the first one." What I said was a lie. I worked hard to find the 4 students with whom Picardi had sex. I obtained their names through extensive use of the university's hearing network. Then I addressed each of them. They happily agreed to help. Apparently, Picardi was a real asshole to any woman he slept with. But more importantly, the female students might think that I was acting in an official capacity. I didn't deny it. I paid a lawyer to take statements from each of them. He smelled blood and was very, very thorough. Essentially, what I did was put the dean and the university between a rock and a hard place. The dean is the chief academic officer, but he is, in essence, just a bureaucrat. He might have known about these incidents, and he would have buried each of them if he had known. But now, the cat has been completely let out of the bag, so if he doesn't act, he will essentially be condoning sexual harassment. And no one in the modern academic world wants to have this stone hung on them. The dean glanced over the testimony. Then he looked at me with a certain amount of calculation. He tried to figure out what it would take to make this all go away. He said, "Well, Jonathan, that's very thorough. Commendable work on your part." In that politically correct world, he had to say this. He probably hated me because I set his chair on fire. But I didn't care. I was planning to leave anyway. I said, "I trust you are ready to do right by Mr. Picardi." I didn't have to state my demands, but I did it anyway. It just felt so good to say that. I said, "According to the sexual harassment policy approved by the Faculty Senate, there is no option other than immediate termination for cause, and the reason must be stated in any future recommendations." I had to add this. I wanted the dean to know that the group of overly narcissistic prima donnas who balance his power at the university would become aware of the situation. That is, if he doesn't do what I asked. And given the number of evil bitches in the leadership of this group, the last thing the dean wanted was to give them a reason. Moreover, he knew that I would take this step unless I got exactly what I wanted, that is, Picardi marching off campus and the door slammed shut on any future career he might have in the academic world. I understood that this would not cause financial harm to Picardi. He could always return to the family crime business. But being suddenly and unceremoniously kicked off campus would be a huge blow to his ego, especially if I was standing there gloating when it happened. The dean was clearly very angry with me. He said, "We'll have to have a hearing on this." I said, "You have a statement. If you want, I can have Bob Swift call you to discuss the consequences." He was the one who took the statements from the Picardi victims. This was the first time I had used the word sacrifice, and it had the intended effect on the dean. Swift was the most ferocious ambulance chaser in Nassau County, so using the words sacrifice and consequences in the same sentence as Swift conveyed the idea. I wanted Picardi destroyed with extreme prejudice, and I wanted it now. 2 hours later, I stood on the steps of the administration building as Picardi was escorted out by 3 security guards. He looked in my direction. I grinned maliciously, driven by all the contempt and hatred I felt for him. He robbed me of the love of my life, and now I was depriving him of his pathetic career. Matt, from my point of view, his expulsion did not even come close to settling the balance of accounts. But I'm a pragmatist, and I knew this was the best I could get. He started to turn towards me. At that moment, the guards on each side grabbed his arms and pulled him too hard towards the parking lot. I laughed mockingly as he was dragged away. I knew that my humble act of revenge had resulted in the sale of all my shares to the university administration, but it was worth it just to witness Picardi's humiliation, and in any case, it was time for me to move on. I've been throwing lines into the pond ever since Zoe wiped her way out of my life, and I was surprised how many places were interested. I eventually negotiated a transfer rank, position, and all to a university in Northwest Washington, D.C. They had a great school of international studies, and I could take the boat to a small marina on the Anacostia River. In short, it was perfect. But I had one serious problem. I liked Alice, and against every ounce of common sense, I wanted to take her with me. In the beginning, she was nothing more than a convenient solution to my own anger and betrayal issues. She made no demands. She was always happy to see me. She was betrayed, and she provided loving companionship whenever I wanted it. In short, she was Buster. But where Buster and her differed was her incredible body. Okay, Alice still wasn't a great conversationalist. But after we started hanging out, she stopped talking so much. I think she just did it because she was nervous. And watching her expand her worldview was like taking a child to the zoo. The time I spent visiting new places with Alice was like showing a smart and energetic child a brave new world. And Alice was perhaps more insatiable for experience than for sex. There was nothing new that did not cause surprise and squeals of delight. I also began to think that Alice might not be as stupid as I first thought. In fact, there were occasional flashes of pure brilliance in her words and actions that made me wonder if she was not so much stupid as immature. This perspective brought out the Henry Higgins in me. Alice was only 25. She was raised by a single mother who worked long hours as a waitress. As a result, Alice did not have much adult guidance as a child, and she had never been outside the Bethpage, Farmingdale area. She can be incredibly sophisticated in sexual matters, but she didn't have to open her mind too much to learn how to have sex. She clearly enjoyed sex a lot. But when I met her, it seemed to me that she used sex as a coin of peace. It was clear that Alice was desperate to please, which, undoubtedly, was associated with a huge burden of childhood insecurity, and it seemed like she thought the only valuable thing she had to offer was her incredible body, which she used as currency to buy recognition. This is simply not true. Alice graduated from a vocational school with high marks. That's why she had the skill set of an administrative assistant, and everyone at the university considered her an extremely capable secretary. But her ability to switch between Alice, the easy virtue, and Alice, the perfect secretary, seemed just a strange quirk. Interestingly, however, she had another strange quirk. This was a real paradox given the fact that Alice was more of a housewife than a housewife. Alice loved children very much. Whenever she was around children, whether they were her friends' children or those just walking down the street, she was full of energy and completely focused. In fact, raising children was the only thing she did better than office work and, of course, devilry. She told me she wanted at least a dozen children. This made me think that perhaps somewhere deep in her psyche there flows a powerful, but as yet unexplored river. She even claimed that she gave up extracurricular activities to be with me. It was kind of naively sweet that she thought I didn't care who else she slept with. However, I did notice that she has gotten a lot stronger over the last couple of months, and Alice, the capable secretary, tended to appear more often after hours. We rarely went outside. I was afraid that people might think we were a couple, and she was always happy to just hang around the apartment and have sex. But every now and then I felt guilty for inviting her to dinner. I mean, if you use someone as cynical as I do, Alice, you might worry that it will reflect poorly on you. At first, it was cheap chain restaurants. But over time, the restaurants became more and more upscale. And during this time, Alice transformed into a much more refined version of her former self. First, she started dressing like an adult, not like a teenager. I think she got her fashion tips from watching other women. But wherever she got her ideas, she now was turning into a stunning personality. It all happened one night in early spring. I planned to take her to Waterzoo in Garden City. I chose places a little out of the area because I didn't want to run into people I knew. This is a cute little bistro with Belgian cuisine and a reputation for wine. We had a dinner reservation for 7:30, so I knocked on her door at 6:45. She opened the door and let me in, looking nervous. The minute I saw her, I knew why. Alice tried a new incarnation of herself. It was cool Alice. She looked stylish and chic, and might I add, beautiful. She has an amazing figure, slim where it needs to be and outrageous in all the other places. She was wearing a little black dress of good quality wool blend, not too short in the legs and with a relatively modest opening in the front. She must have been wearing an industrial bra underneath. But the real miracle was her face. Alice only wears makeup at work, and I wasn't sure that she even knew how to use it correctly. But she obviously did it, because she did everything she could for me. She has a classic girl next door face. Yeah, I said, the girl next door. What do you call a round-shaped face with perfectly even features, a button nose, a beautiful mouth, and huge cornflower blue eyes? She even has a scattering of freckles. She completes the look with a short cap of thick, naturally curly blonde hair. Like I said, the girl next door. Any stranger who saw Alice in this new incarnation would be amazed by her pure beauty. I just stood there with my mouth open. She took this as disapproval and said in a panic, "Sorry, I can change." I blurted out, "Do not change under any circumstances. You are wonderful." She turned purple with embarrassment. It suddenly dawned on me that I had never complimented her. In fact, perhaps no one has ever complimented her. The restaurant itself was an experience. From the moment we walked in, I realized that I had just arrived with the most attractive woman to grace the place in a long time. Heads turned, men looked, women seethed with jealousy. The master, having seated us, fell on his face. There were a couple of young, very handsome men who looked at her not as if she were the main course. I suddenly remembered my time in Port Jefferson. I was completely confused by the lightning of jealousy that pierced me. How could I become the owner of Alice? Of the two, the more handsome one finally came to our table. He was kind enough to extend his hand to me and introduce himself first. But it was obvious that he had come to talk to Alice. He looked at her politely and said, "I know that sounds like the oldest phrase in the world, but I have a strange feeling that I know you from somewhere." Alice looked like a sphinx as she said, "Of course, Tim. We spent 4 years in college together." He looked completely shocked and said, "I don't remember you." She said in the tone of a competent secretary, "Alice, you probably don't remember me, Tim. You were the rich big man on campus, and I was just a girl from the trailer park." Then you could see it dawn on him, and he couldn't believe his eyes. He muttered, "Alice Withers." She grinned and said, "In the flesh. And if I remember correctly, the last time we saw each other was in the back seat of your father's car." She dropped this bomb with complete aplomb. I thought to myself, is she really trying to take a piece away from this guy? Whatever it was, it worked. He blushed and quickly retreated back to his desk. He and his friend talked animatedly for a few seconds, and both turned their heads to look at Alice in surprise, who just sat there and looked serene and self-sufficient. She turned to me. We talked about her growing up the entire dinner. I never asked anything about her life. I realized with embarrassment that my complete lack of interest in her story was one of the many gestures of disrespect I had made towards her. So I said, "I really want to get to know you better. Tell me about your life." She was born and raised in a trailer, even double width. My father was in the Ministry of Internal Affairs from the very beginning. She claimed that she had a happy childhood, although her mother was hardly around. Alice grinned and said, "And when Mom was around, I got real sex education through those thin walls." And it gave me a much better understanding of why Alice defined all her social interactions in sexual terms. She said, I knew I would have to take up a profession if I was ever going to get out of there. So I worked really hard and went to secretarial school, and when I graduated, I got a job at the university. She finally added, "Of course, everyone I've ever worked for has wanted to have sex with me." She said it like it was standard business practice. She then continued, "At the end of the day, it was just sex. But I knew it was inappropriate. I learned this in my business ethics class at VOC school." I smiled at this. She must have said the same thing to every boss who ever tried to get her to do it. It was as if she were teaching a Sunday school lesson. Then, perhaps for the first time, I looked her straight in the eyes. She smiled her usual meaningless smile. But her big cornflower blue eyes studied me carefully, and shockingly, the intelligence there was insightful and focused. The person behind those eyes viewed me like a researcher observing a lab rat. And it dawned on me like an epiphany. She was playing me. Have you ever had those moments when what you just thought was true turned out to be completely different? In that split second, I realized that Alice was not brainless. She was completely and utterly wild. In general, I had to respect such a brilliant person. Even the sex was fake. She chose the perfect camouflage. No one took her seriously or respected her. And no one will ever suspect a poor, ignorant woman of easy virtue like Alice of treason. And therefore no one felt that she was manipulating them. Alice's beautiful body and slutty behavior allowed her to make every man do exactly what she wanted. And every woman was vulnerable because she was considered a brainless lightweight. I began to feel as if I was sitting at a table opposite a woman who was a little more calculating than Machiavelli himself. The only thing I knew for sure was that this man was dangerous, especially anyone who got in her way. It was probably the fact that she was starting to fall in love with me that gave me a glimpse behind the scenes. Perhaps no one had ever come this close before. And this led to the final realization. I was disgusted. I looked at her sincerely and said, "This is all nonsense, isn't it, Alice? You made it. For some reason, you separated me and Zoe. What was it?" The defense was restored. Poor and simple false Alice sat there and looked scared. She said with tears in her innocent childish eyes, "This is just mean. How could you say something like that? Why are you picking on me?" And one crystal tear rolled down her cheek and plopped onto the tablecloth. I looked with disgust and said, "Is it really Alice? Now I know. You organized every aspect of it. Even Picardy. Did you give him the idea to ask Zoe out on a date?" A shadow passed over her eyes. I hit her so suddenly that she didn't have time to go into full DEFCON 1. "I knew it," I said. "You realized that I would be devastated, and you correctly guessed that I would turn to you for revenge, right? If not, you've probably planned for contingencies." Cracks began to appear on its facade. A sly expression appeared on her face. It was like a fox contemplating a particularly delicious chicken. It was the scariest thing I've ever seen. I said, "That sex in the parking lot, he had to get my attention, right? You wanted to encourage me to think about sex with you. You showed me what it was like. A bloody, premeditated act on your part, isn't it?" She smiled slyly and drawled, "It worked, didn't it, love?" I continued, "And the crap you pulled on Zoe was your idea, not Picardy's. He just did it because he wanted to get Zoe into bed." Then I stopped and said, "Which of you two knew Zoe's story? It seems that Picardy is not smart enough to control subsequent events so skillfully." The real Alice began to emerge. Her face took on a strikingly powerful expression, almost inhuman. She hissed, Of course." She laughed dismissively and said, "I knew the stupid bitch's backstory as soon as she showed up on campus. It's funny what a sister would tell her sister if she's on the same page about men." She focused on me and said, "So I knew exactly what would happen if it seemed like you betrayed her." She grinned openly, adding, "Picardy is the dumbest moron I know." I said with admiration in my voice, "So we are sitting here at this moment in time because you brought us here. Why did you do this, Alice? What did you hope to get?" She said with a small laugh, "You, of course. You'll be the perfect husband. Smart, a good provider, hardworking, great in bed, and I want kids, lots of kids, and I think you'll be the best dad in the world. Everything was very carefully planned. I felt like a puppy in a window display. Alice saw me, thought I was cute, and bought me. What a fool I was. Have you ever felt like you dodged a bullet? It awakened something deep in my reptilian brain, and if we weren't sitting in a 4-star restaurant, I probably would have had sex with her right there. Thinking about what I planned to offer her that night made me shiver. I was going to ask her to come with me to Washington. That was the whole point of the evening. Of course, then I thought that she was a mare and not the granddaughter of Cardinal Richelieu. The fact is that Alice was beautiful, incredibly sexy, and eager to please, perhaps a little unreliable in terms of fidelity, and of course, completely sociopathic. But it also offered many benefits to a man. I knew that she would ensure that all my sexual needs were satisfied. Plus, now I knew she could remove any inconvenient people from my life without leaving fingerprints. More importantly, I always wanted children, so the prospect of Alice and I with a house full of children was very appealing. The problem was that she was such a frighteningly dangerous manipulator that I was afraid of ending up in Guantanamo if I disagreed with her on some minor issue, like the color of the curtains in the dining room. Therefore, there was a small adjustment plan. When we returned to her place, I made a grand gesture, turning her to face me. I took both her hands and looked into her eyes with love. From the look on her face, I think she thought I was about to propose. Instead, I said, "I know I burned all my bridges at this university. It was worth it to get Picardy. But I graduated here, so I accepted a new position in Washington. I'm leaving at the end of next week." She shuddered with excitement. I said, drawing out the moment, "You've made my life very happy these past few months. I just want you to know that." She heard wedding bells, so I said with the sincerity of a Boy Scout, "And I will always be grateful to you for standing by me after the devastating loss of the love of my life. I will never forget you." Then I quickly kissed her forehead, turned, and walked out the door. Behind me, I heard a painful sigh. All I could think about as I walked back to my car was, "I hope this gives you the happy ending you so carefully planned, you two-faced bitch." Zoya was sitting on a bench on the port side and drinking cold Yunling beer. I took us to the Potomac. She was the usual beautiful, energetic, and cheerful person. It was a classic sunny Sunday in Washington, and in the words of Robert Browning, God was in heaven and all was right with the world. I showed up on Zoe's doorstep the next morning with a feeling of guilt. She was delighted. It was a pleasant surprise, considering I more or less ignored her completely and then spent the next 2 months having sex with her main rival. I'd call dueling pistols if I were her. But Zoe is better than me. We discussed everything over morning coffee. She didn't look shocked, but she is also much more insightful than me. No kidding. The faces carved on Mount Rushmore are more insightful than I am. She said that Alice immediately became her friend as soon as it became clear that Zoe and I were a couple, and this behavior seemed strange to her. Zoe thought Alice was going too far with her warnings about me and how many hearts I'd broken on campus. However, Alice had been at university for a long time, and for all Zoe knew, I might just be pretending. So when Alice came to her after that fateful week with an "I told you so" speech, it only reinforced the months of her whispering in Zoe's ear, and predictably, all Zoe could see was the second coming of arch-traitor Charlie Riley. So she lost it. She loved Charlie madly, and he betrayed her by marrying another woman. Then, against her better judgment, she fell in love with me even more, and I committed an even more serious sin in her eyes. It was a sin of intimacy. At least in Charlie's case, Zoe didn't know the other woman. But she knew Alice, and she knew what kind of person she was. So, in addition to the pain of her loss, Zoe also felt the humiliation of having such a famous prostitute like Alice boast about her imaginary weekend with me. This drove her into a state of rage. This was quite understandable. After all, I had personal experience with exactly the same feeling. It was that same all-consuming anger that made me go to Alice in the first place. And just like that, Zoe went and gave Picardy a sex he'll never forget. She immediately realized that this was the stupidest thing she could do. But Zoe is a strong-willed woman with a huge sense of pride, and she could not leave such an insult as she thought I had given her without a proper response. Like I said, she's a spirited little bitch. So two supposedly smart people managed to cram a lifetime of misunderstandings and bad decisions into 6 months, and we both suffered greatly from self-inflicted wound. In view of this, we both made a solemn promise. This cycle will end forever now and forever, and we agreed to love each other and only each other for the rest of our lives. I didn't ask what she had been doing in the 4 months since that fateful day. It was none of my business. We weren't married or even firmly committed when we separated. In fact, in the entire time we knew each other, we were only officially a couple for about 36 hours. However, no matter how objectively I understood our situation, I still cannot describe how glad I was that Zoe was not spending time with Picardy when I showed up on her doorstep. And it didn't take long before the old flame flared up into an all-consuming fire. This led to me inviting her to try living together in Washington. I sold my house and bought a very comfortable condominium on Massachusetts Avenue closer to the National Cathedral. The place was ready to accommodate Buster, and I could walk to campus most days. Zoe still held her position at Farmingdale, but finding a job in Washington would not be difficult for her, and her lack of teaching status would make the transition easier. She planned to visit several campuses next week to see what she could find. It was already very late in the hiring process, but any place that still had openings would be happy to have a research specialist like her. If not, there was always next year, and she could stay in Washington and write. We will never be separated again. We talked about what we needed to do to make our relationship work, and we both agreed that the one thing that was non-negotiable was communication in all circumstances, in good times and bad. This means that if we hear or see something that raises a question, we will immediately raise this for discussion and resolve it. There will be no mere assumptions and no secrets for the good of the other person. The misunderstanding was the lever that separated us, and we were both determined not to let any misunderstanding lead us down the path to destruction again. We were both guilty of this crime. We both suffered the consequences, and we were both smart enough to not let it happen again. We immediately re-established our intimacy. But if you remember, with the exception of one night before the Great Shock, we never actually slept together, so there were some wedding jitters when we got into bed that night. We lived together for several months, but this was uncharted territory since we planned to sleep in the same bed, and this time forever. It was just another nasty hot and humid July night in Washington. We had dinner at the Clyde in Georgetown and drove back past the Naval Observatory to my place. She came out of the bathroom wearing a long t-shirt. This is where she slept. I knew there was nothing underneath. I was wearing my regular boxers. She slid towards me. I think we both considered it our official moving-in night. The wedding will take place in the uncertain future, but I will never lose her again. She looked at me intently. Most men would call this the have sex with me look, but with Zoya, it was more than that. It was as if she was psychically merging with me. We made love. I smiled and said, "You and I as a couple are so much more than what we are as individuals, and I want you to promise me that you will be mine forever. Will you do that?" She pretended to be puzzled and said with a cheerful laugh, "Sir, I don't know. What are you asking me?" I grinned and said, "Marry me, you fool. Let's do it now. We're both a little stupid when it comes to ourselves, so I want to put a ring on your finger to prevent any future misunderstandings." And the next week, I married the only person in this world whose love made me special. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. 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 Click to the next one.